Thank you very much. So I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate those intrepid few who've stayed till the very last session. It's very much appreciated, and it's a pleasure to be here in Munich. So I'm going to tell you about our work with the Bionic Pancreas, and we do hope, with all humility, to try and change the paradigm of treatment of type 1 diabetes by taking advantage of new technologies that have been developed in recent years and by combining them in new ways. Here are my conflicts of interest. And the reason that we've done this is because we feel that there are simply inadequate tools for patients with type 1 diabetes to manage their blood glucose. I think that this is well demonstrated by the fact that, at least in the United States, only 30% of adult patients with type 1 diabetes are able to meet their glycemic goals, which for most of them is a hemoglobin A1C less than 7%. This number is even lower for children with type 1 diabetes, 14%, despite the fact that for the younger children, their glycemic goal is actually higher, at A1C of 7.5%. This cartoon is actually one drawn by a patient with type 1 diabetes, and it depicts the classic Swiss Army knife, but with the various tools that are used now. So, of course, usual care demands a tremendous amount of patience. It requires them to check blood glucose very frequently and to be able to accurately count carbohydrates, to make calculations about how much insulin to give, then deliver those doses. And in most cases, it takes very frequent checks and administration of doses to achieve good blood glucose control, and even more checks and administration of carbohydrates to prevent and treat hypoglycemia. A small minority of patients use new technology, the continuous glucose monitor, and that's tremendously helpful. In the US, it's only about 15% of patients use a continuous glucose monitor, and perhaps that's because to get the full benefit of this technology, they have to devote a tremendous amount of attention to it. So it provides information every 5 minutes, but it's simply not humanly possible to pay attention to the information that often. So what we're trying to do is to use this technology in a different way, to take advantage of all of those blood glucose measurements that the continuous glucose monitor provides, and they make decisions about dosing of insulin, and as I'll tell you in a moment, in our case, also glucagon, every time a new piece of information arrives, which for a continuous glucose monitor is every 5 minutes. So you get to make 288 decisions a day, and all those decisions are made automatically. Now, it's true that it's difficult to predict what's going to happen with a single dose of insulin, and patients will tell you that they can have the same situation, same amount of food, take the same amount of insulin, get a completely different result. And to some degree, that's also true with the Bionic Pancreas, but we get to make many more of those decisions. So if something unexpected happens, we can compensate for it later automatically. And the algorithms we use are very good at determining in an objective way how the patient responds to insulin dosing. Now, of course, type 1 diabetes is a disease of an absolute lack of insulin, but it's also a disease of a functional deficiency of glucagon. So after a year or two of type 1 diabetes, the function of the alpha cells no longer is normal, and they no longer respond to hypoglycemia with release of glucagon. And that glucagon ordinarily would act on the liver to cause breakdown of glycogen and release of glucose into the bloodstream, and that's really the most important, quantitatively important hedge against hypoglycemia that exists. But in the absence of beta cells, the paracrine regulation of these alpha cells is lost, and they no longer respond appropriately, and this makes people with type 1 diabetes particularly vulnerable to hypoglycemia. So we wanted to replace not only the insulin function, but the glucagon function of the endocrine pancreas. And an example of why we think this is important is shown on this slide. Even if you were making quote-unquote perfect decisions about insulin dosing at the time you made them, the situation can of course change, and even rapid-acting insulin is not so rapid-acting, and one can't simply withdraw insulin that's already been given. So it takes about 70 minutes on average for Humalog, for instance, to peak in the blood after it's delivered. And that means that if you stop delivering, it's going to take quite some time for the insulin levels in the blood to fall. So in this scenario, you can see that if we have blood glucose at roughly 4 milligrams per deciliter, well controlled, and the person starts a moderate exercise, their blood glucose can fall very rapidly. And you don't know that that fall is occurring if you're relying on CGM until about 7 minutes into the exercise. So that means you've only got 7 minutes left to make an intervention to prevent that hypoglycemic event. And we can all imagine that stopping insulin delivery at that point is going to have very little effect on the plasma insulin levels 7 minutes later. In fact, it will have virtually no effect. So stopping insulin delivery can't prevent that hypoglycemic event. It might reduce its severity, it might reduce its duration, but it cannot prevent it. So the only thing a system that relies on insulin can do is to sound an alarm and tell the person to take some carbohydrates. And of course, that can be problematic if they're asleep and don't wake to the alarm, or if they don't have carbohydrates handy. On the other hand, glucagon, unlike insulin, is absorbed very, very rapidly. It has a time to peak in blood of about 15 minutes after delivery. And you can get very significant levels of glucagon in the blood within a few minutes of delivery. It's a smaller peptide. We think that's probably why it's absorbed faster when delivered subcutaneously. And so a dose of glucagon given 7 minutes before a hypoglycemic event can indeed prevent that event, can make the blood glucose rebound and prevent the event entirely. And importantly, it can do it without any input and any action on the part of the patient wearing it. So it's perfect for overnight, or if the person is unaware they're going low, or if they don't have carbohydrates with them. So the algorithms that we use to control the insulin and glucagon were developed by my colleagues Ed Damiano and Faraz El-Khatib at Boston University, and together we've refined them over the years. They're unique in that they use only the patient's weight for initialization, so it needs to know nothing about the past insulin regimen, which is important if that insulin regimen was not well considered or not well optimized. It's important if you want to use this as the initial therapy for newly diagnosed type 1 diabetes. It's important for practical reasons, because if you want this to be a broadly adopted therapy, it can't require a tremendous amount of work on the part of the clinician to prescribe it. And it also is important because the system had to be made robustly adaptive in order to do this. And that meant that if the insulin needs of a person changes over time, the system can rapidly adapt to them. For instance, during development, when one goes from childhood into adolescence, insulin requirements can go up dramatically. For instance, during illness, even during the menstrual cycle, women's insulin needs will change, and the system is robustly adaptive. In fact, it can adapt without any prior information within 24 hours, in fact, often much less, to achieve very good glucose control. It uses a pharmacokinetic model of insulin, and we assume relatively slow pharmacokinetics so that we don't stack insulin even in people who are on the slow side of insulin pharmacokinetics. They vary quite a bit from person to person. And importantly, for the ease of use, this system no longer requires carbohydrate counting. So we only ask the patients optionally to announce meals. They don't have to announce meals, and the system works well without that. But if they choose to announce a meal, we ask them to announce it only in a qualitative sense. This is a typical breakfast for me. This is a smaller than usual lunch for me. And the system keeps track of how much insulin is used in the 4 hours after the meal for each of those times and types, and then keeps a running average over time. And when they announce a meal, it will give them 75% of the insulin it predicts they will need for that meal to get a little bit of it on board as early as possible. And then the remainder is given automatically. If they neglect to announce the meal, it simply doses automatically in response to the rise in blood glucose. So this is an example of one of our various early experiments where there were no meal announcements. This is a 28-year-old woman with type 1 diabetes who had no stimulatable C-peptide, so she had no endogenous insulin secretion. And she ate 3 large meals, 108 grams, 80 grams, and 80 grams of carbohydrates, and the system responded to the rise in blood glucose automatically. You can see after this meal, the blood glucose rises. The system automatically starts dosing insulin, and that's the blue strikes downward. In this case, the larger doses are about 1.75 units, but they can be given every 5 minutes. This is sufficient to bring the blood glucose down, and you can see in this particular case, perhaps a bit too much was given. We've refined the algorithm a bit since then, but it does provide us an opportunity to see how glucagon works. You can see it looks like the blood glucose is going to become negative into hypoglycemic territory, and a single dose of glucagon is given here. That's 15 micrograms of glucagon, or 1.5% of a rescue dose. And you can see it provides an almost immediate change in the trajectory of the blood glucose. And then there's smaller doses that are given to rebound the blood glucose. from about 3.9 up to 6.7, and hypoglycemia is averted, and then an interplay between small doses of insulin and small doses of glucagon overnight keeps the blood glucose in the normal range. So that initial study was done in the inpatient setting. Since then, we've been doing all of our studies in the outpatient setting, and we've been using this device to do it. It is an iPhone that runs a custom app that has the control algorithm. If I were to turn this device over, you would see a Dexcom G4 CGM, and they're hardwired together so that the CGM information goes directly to the iPhone. The device will automatically run, and it also provides a user interface so that the subject can input a meal if they wish. And then the iPhone controls 2 tandem t:slim pumps via Bluetooth technology to automatically deliver insulin or glucagon through standard insulin infusion sets. This is an example of one of our first outpatient studies, and this shows the same individual under usual care where they were controlling their own insulin pump with conventional insulin pump therapy, and when they were on the Bionic Pancreas, each for a 5-day period. And you can see that on the Bionic Pancreas, there's far more of the time is spent between 3.9 and 10, and there's much less hypoglycemia, less than 3.9. You can see these little tick marks here are times when the individual had to take carbohydrate to treat hypoglycemia. There were none of those times during 5 days on the Bionic Pancreas. So this is an individual example. This is a summary of the data from that study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2014. And in this graph, the mean glucose under the control conditions, or that's conventional insulin pump therapy, is shown for each of the subjects. The size of the circle is proportional to the amount of hypoglycemia, time less than 60 milligrams per deciliter, or 3.3 millimoles per liter. And the size of the circle is proportional to the amount of time greater than 180 milligrams per deciliter, 10 millimoles per liter. And you can see that on the Bionic Pancreas, the blood glucose for most of the subject is lower, although in a few cases it actually rises. And the amount of hypoglycemia is significantly reduced, so that the time less than 3.3 is reduced from 3.7 to 1.5%, while at the same time the mean glucose is reduced from 8.8 to 7.4 millimoles per liter. Perhaps most importantly of all, if you look at this line, this is the line corresponding to 8.6 millimoles per liter, or the estimated average glucose consistent with a hemoglobin A1C of 7%. And you can see that all of the individuals achieved a mean glucose that would have been predicted to give them an A1C less than 7%, whereas only half of them did under usual therapy. And I should point out that these individuals already are doing a lot better than your average type 1 diabetes patient. They were early adopters of technology who volunteered for our trial and were pretty sophisticated, but the system did much better even than they did. We would predict that in an unselected population of patients, we would probably have a larger difference between the control and the Bionic Pancreas arms. This is a similar study that we performed in adolescents, but in this case it was done at a diabetes camp. Again, under usual care conditions, this was at a diabetes camp where the subjects were in a cabin that had a counselor with type 1 diabetes. A nurse was assigned to each cabin, and a doctor adjusted their insulin therapy every day. So that was the control condition. And then that was compared with an automated blood glucose control with the Bionic Pancreas. And you can see that for most of the individuals, the Bionic Pancreas substantially improved their glycemic control, either by reducing the mean glucose or decreasing the amount of hypoglycemia, for instance, in this individual and this individual, or both. And the total amount, the mean amount of hypoglycemia was reduced, as was the mean glucose. This particular individual had a technical fault with the Bionic Pancreas in the first few days, but they were included because the analysis was according to intention to treat principle. On the last 3 days, they were down in this cluster of other subjects as well. One interesting thing about this study is that we were able to know that the amount of carbohydrates consumed in both groups were the same because the subjects were eating the same meals in the camp cafeteria. And under those conditions, the total insulin used was the same by the Bionic Pancreas and the usual care arm, which is interesting given that we were able to lower the mean blood glucose significantly. This is just a recently published study, published in Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology a couple months ago. This is a similar camp study done in pre-adolescent children, so the previous study was 12 to 20. In this experiment, we did children 6 to 11 years of age, and you can see the result is very similar with a reduction in mean glucose, a reduction in hypoglycemia, and the same amount of insulin delivered under the both conditions. The last story that I'm going to tell you about with the bihormonal bionic pancreas is a study that is not yet published. We're going to be submitting it in the coming week. And this was a multicenter, fully home use study. So in this case, we trained patients on the use of the study and sent them home to do their normal work, exercise regimens, their normal diet. So they had no restrictions on diet or exercise and lived their normal routines for 11 days. Or they had 11 days of conventional pump therapy with or without a CGM, depending on whether they used one ordinarily. And this was done in random order. And we had it at 4 centers throughout the United States. So a total of 39 subjects actually completed the study. And they had one limitation, which is that they had to live within 30 minutes and stay within 60 minutes of the study center during the study so that we could reach them if there was a technical problem. And we had remote monitoring in both arms for severe hypoglycemia, severe biochemical hypoglycemia, that is less than 50 milligrams per deciliter. We would call them if that persisted for more than 15 minutes, and that was done both in the control and bionic pancreas arm. And we would also control them if there was a technical problem that persisted for more than 15 minutes. But other than that, we didn't monitor them, their blood glucose at all. And so this is an example of our Boston site. They had to live within the blue boundary, and then they had to stay within the red boundary. And you can see that this actually included parts of 4 states. So it was a relatively little restriction on their movements. And this is the data from that trial. You can see it looks very similar. Again, we lower the mean blood glucose overall from 9 plus or minus 1.6 millimoles per liter to 7.8 plus or minus 0.6 millimoles per liter. Notice not only is there a reduction in the mean, but there's a significant reduction in the standard deviation of the mean, and that, of course, is related to the adaptive nature of the bionic pancreas. In all these cases, if the mean blood glucose is too high, it will be more aggressive on subsequent days. If it's too low, it will be less aggressive. And so you tend to get this clustering of mean blood glucoses very tightly. We reduced hypoglycemia. We've made some changes to the algorithm over the years, and so our amount of hypoglycemia in each trial gets a little bit smaller. So in this case, the amount of hypoglycemia in the control group was quite good, 1.9%, but we were down to 0.6% at the time in the bionic pancreas group. In this case, there was a small but statistically significant increase in the insulin total daily dose in the bionic pancreas group, and this was accounted for almost entirely by these individuals that had very high mean glucoses under the usual care condition. The bionic pancreas did give them significantly more insulin and brought them down into a lower range. This is an additional way of looking at the data. This is one subject, and this shows their mean glucose every day for 11 days. You can see that the green is the target range that we would like to have them in, and they were not in that range on average any of the days during the 11 days that they were on usual care, and their blood glucose was higher and more variable at night. And that's consistent with what we've seen, that people tend to run their blood glucose higher at night because they're, of course, concerned about nocturnal hypoglycemia. And this mean is very consistent over the 11 days with what an average patient with type 1 diabetes achieves in the United States. So this is the same individual now I'm going to show you on the bionic pancreas for those 11 days. And you can see that their mean blood glucose is very consistent from day to day because the bionic pancreas is constantly adjusting to their differing insulin needs. On the previous day, they had similar amounts of insulin on every day, as a lot of patients tend to do, and that led to very different blood glucose results. In this case, they had different amounts of insulin every day, but a very similar blood glucose result from day to day. And you can see that they also do very well at night. In fact, they have a slightly lower mean glucose at night, which we typically see, and that's because automated control is actually easier at night when you don't have meals and you don't have exercise, which are more difficult to deal with. So we also, for the first time, were able to look at some safety parameters over a reasonable length of time. We looked at blood pressure, weight, of a large panel of hematology and chemistry labs at the beginning and the end, and we saw no evidence of changes in blood pressure or weight and no safety signals on any of the chemistry labs. And I didn't mention, but the amount of glucagon we used was about 0.5 milligram over a 24-hour period in these individuals, which is very typical to what we've seen in our recent trials. We've also looked at some psychosocial measures of people's satisfaction with therapy and diabetes distress, and I'll just briefly say that this shows that measures of diabetes distress typically went down in the study, even in the control arm, perhaps a study effect due to the fact that we were monitoring them, but they were substantially improved even compared to the control arm in the Bionic pancreas group. Now I'm going to briefly tell you about a study that we did to look at the tolerability of glucagon, among other things. As you know, high doses of glucagon can be associated with nausea, and in some of our studies we've seen a very small signal for nausea in the Bionic pancreas group relative to the usual care group, and in others we have not. And we were interested to do a study that was randomized, placebo-controlled, and blinded, because all of our previous studies were open label and we warned people that they could be nauseated. So it could lead to a bias in these results. So in this case, we took people who had self-reported hypoglycemia unawareness, and interestingly, 68% of them used a continuous glucose monitor, which is quite atypical for the population at large, probably because they had hypoglycemia unawareness. We then had them control their own insulin with an insulin pump according to their own method, and then we had them wear the Bionic pancreas with only the glucagon portion working. And so they were supposed to manage their blood glucose as normal, and they didn't know on any given day whether they would be receiving glucagon or placebo, which we thought would mean that they would not, for instance, take any risks thinking that they might be protected by the glucagon. And they were randomized on a daily basis to either fill their Bionic pancreas, their glucagon-only Bionic pancreas, with either placebo or glucagon. And then our primary outcome was area over the curve in less than 60, so it's a measure of total hypoglycemia exposure. So this is our randomization scheme, white being placebo days and red being glucagon days, and a blinding device that we developed to do this. This is an example of one patient, and what you see on this top graph is the mean glucose on each day of the 14 days. And then the size of the circle is proportional to the amount of time less than 60. And black days are placebo days and red days are glucagon days. And I think you can see that the black days tend to have a lot more hypoglycemia. This is the same measure at night. And this is a summary of all the data overall. And you can see that what we see is a reduction in the size of these circles, meaning a reduction in hypoglycemia on glucagon days versus placebo days. But the overall mean of the glucose doesn't change. Overall, we had a 74% reduction in the area over the curve in less than 60. If you look at only the nighttime from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., it's a 91% reduction in hypoglycemia. So, and again, remarkably, no significant change in the mean glucose. We did increase the time in range of, I guess this is 3.9 to 10, from 62% to 69%. Although there was no increase in the amount of time in hyperglycemia, as you can see here. The mean glucagon we used was 0.48 milligrams a day, so it was actually almost identical to what we saw in our bihormonal Bionic pancreas, which did surprise me a little bit because I thought we might use more, given that the Bionic pancreas was not withdrawing insulin in addition. That's an additional tool it has. But what was fascinating was that the blinding was completely effective. They were able to guess on only 42% of days whether they had insulin or glucagon or placebo, which meant less than due to chance. So they had no idea whether they were receiving glucagon or placebo, which means, I guess, that it had to have been fairly well tolerated. We asked them every day to document the amount of nausea they had on a 0 to 10 visual analog scale. And what we saw was that there was a 0.1 on a 10 centimeter scale on the glucagon days and a 0.0 on placebo days, with no statistically significant difference between the two. And there was no difference in the insulin dose administered by the patients during the study. So what it says to me is that at least in most individuals, this dose of glucagon is very well tolerated without any nausea when you do it in a blinded fashion, and there's no bias associated with the concern that we put in their minds with our consent documents. And this glucagon-only system might have utility on its own, for instance, in the case of congenital hyperinsulinism or in individuals with post-bariatric hypoglycemia. So I'm just going to tell you briefly about something else that we've been working on. It's not quite done yet. We've been using a target glucose of 5.6 millimoles per liter for all of our studies thus far, and you can see that the means we achieved were slightly higher than that, about 30 to 40 milligrams per deciliter higher than that, or perhaps 2 millimoles per liter higher than that. Now, it's not necessary to achieve means this low, so we thought, well, what if we raised the target a little bit? Perhaps we would use less insulin or glucagon, and perhaps at a higher set point we could achieve very good results without the glucagon, so we could do insulin-only regulation. We think that this would have certain disadvantages. Of course, if there was hypoglycemia, you'd have to rely on the individual to treat it, but one of the challenges we have is that there's no stable form of glucagon currently on the market for pumping. Now, 2 companies have developed such glucagons, and we're actively testing them, and we believe that we will have one of those stable glucagons in our pivotal trial starting next year. However, we might be able to get an insulin-only version of the Bionic Pancreas on the market even sooner. So we wanted to know how well that would work. And this is some preliminary data of a system comparing usual care with an insulin pump therapy to 2 different iterations, and I won't get into the exact details, of the insulin-only Bionic Pancreas with a set point of 6.4 millimoles per liter, so slightly higher. And what you can see is that we achieve very good blood glucose control, an average close that would give on average would give a predicted A1C of about 7%, although some individuals escape that, and significantly less hypoglycemia than in the usual care group. 2.3% is reduced to 0.8 or 1.0%. So we're still achieving very good amounts of hypoglycemia, but we have a slightly higher amount of hypoglycemia than the bihormonal system and a slightly higher mean glucose. So in order to make the system safe with an insulin-only setting, we have to give up something in the way of glycemic regulation and perhaps hypoglycemia safety. So we're actually doing a study now where we're testing 110 milligrams per deciliter as a set point for an insulin-only system. So my conclusions are that fully automated control of glycemia is feasible, finally. We have the technology to do it. The announcements of the meals modestly improve glycemic control. I didn't show you this data, but it improves glycemic control by less than 1 millimole per liter. So if you, in our early studies, people announced meals about 70% of the time. We asked them to do it, but there was no enforcement of that, and they announced about 70% of meals, so you can think about that when you look at those results. The microdose glucagon is very effective at preventing hypoglycemia with minimal side effects. A bihormonal Bionic Pancreas can remarkably both reduce the mean glucose and hypoglycemia at the same time, things that don't very often happen when you intensify therapy in type 1 diabetes. And an insulin-only Bionic Pancreas is superior to usual care, but there's a trade-off in terms of mean glucose or hypoglycemia that you have to accept if you use an insulin-only Bionic Pancreas. So just to finish up, I'll tell you about our timeline. We've completed many of these studies, and we have the stable glucagon studies that we're going to be doing this year and early next year, and we're going to be moving into bridging studies starting this year, and then into pivotal studies next year. So we're going to first do a pivotal study with an insulin-only system that will take about 6 months, and then a pivotal study that will start later next year with the bihormonal system that will take a year. And the reason that is a longer study is because the FDA is requiring that to achieve approval for both the Bionic Pancreas and a chronic use indication for the stable glucagon. And so we expect that we're going to be submitting an application for approval to the FDA in 2017 with, we hope, approval of the system for sale in the United States in 2018, the insulin-only version. And we hope to have approval for sale in the United States for the bihormonal version in 2019. So this is now not something that is in the sort of undefined future. It used to be that people would say, we're going to have automated glucose control 5 years from now, and it was always 5 years from now, no matter how long you looked. And now we're talking about in 2 years. So at least we're within that 5 year, and we actually internally we like to talk in months. So I think this really is going to change our lives as endocrinologists because we'll be able to give people a system that will reliably give them very good blood glucose control and will actually require a lot less effort on their part and on our part to achieve that, and be associated with a lot less worry. about hypoglycemia. So my colleagues have started a company to commercialize this technology. I didn't join the company because then I would have been prevented by conflict of interest rules from continuing my research. But the company's called Bionics, and this is the device they built. It's called the iLet, and of course in homage to the iLets of Langerhans. And you can see its scale. That's laying on my hand, so it's a little bit bigger than an insulin pump, but not a lot bigger. And it incorporates the receiver for a Dexcom CGM, all the algorithm technology, and a dual chamber pump that's set up so that the insulin and the glucagon reservoirs can't be cross-channeled. You can't accidentally put one in the wrong place. It automatically detects whether it has a glucagon reservoir, so it will default to a higher set point, a more conservative set point if the glucagon runs out or if there's an occlusion on the glucagon limb. So it would go into an insulin-only mode. And in fact, the plan is to, once this is approved, sell this as the same device, but just with the glucagon chamber closed off and the firmware set so that it can't give glucagon. And then as soon as the glucagon is approved, a firmware upgrade will allow it to function in bihormonal mode. So this coming soon, I hope, to a clinic near you. This is what the user interface looks like. It actually shows the continuous glucose monitor trace, announced meals, insulin and glucagon dosing. It can show the current or the mean glucose. It can calculate a predicted A1C. This is the way you announce meals now. You can say beginning, middle, or end of the day in case you're a shift worker. We didn't want to say breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And you choose the size of fork that is appropriate for the meal. So this would be a typical meal. This would be less than typical. This would be a snack, or this would be a more than typical size meal. So it's very intuitive. It's also going to have a feature where you can lock out the meal announcements if you want to put it on a small child, for instance, and it would be working entirely in an automated mode. So that is what we're trying to accomplish coming soon. As soon as we get it approved in the United States, of course, we will hope that we can submit those same data to European authorities and bring it to Europe. And we post information about what we're working on our website, which is bionicpancreas.org. And my colleagues that have the company have a website, betabionics.com. And I'd like to hope that the way we practice endocrinology now and the way we manage insulin will seem as ancient as something you'd see on an ancient artifact only a few years from now. So I thank you very much for your attention. I want to thank the volunteers and my staff who work with me and my colleagues for making these studies possible. And I thank you very much for your attention.